Welcome again, everyone. I hope everyone is having a beautiful morning. And today, Dr. Billy Flower is going to talk about the 5 non-negotiables in swine reproduction. He hasn't told me yet which one. I'm looking forward to his talk. And so this webinar is sponsored by IMV Imaging. So we thank them for their support. And like I said, we're going to wait one more minute here for everyone to join.
Okay.
Dr. Billy Flowers from North Carolina State University, joined there 1987 as a faculty, is still there, and is a distinguished professor with a teaching and research appointment. For those that don't know, the level of distinguished professor is one of the highest that you can achieve at an university. His research program focuses on improving male and female fertility, and I know most of you already know Dr. Billy Flowers, but just in case you don't, Dr. Flowers has published over 170 peer-reviewed journal articles and book chapters and more than 450 extension articles dealing with swine reproduction, physiology, and artificial insemination. So we're gonna have his talk, and then at the end we're gonna have questions and answers. Also, we're going to have Emmanuel Chateau from IMV Imaging joining us in the discussion as a co-host at the end. And Emmanuel, he has focused the last 2 decades in ultrasonography equipment. In 2001, he was part of the team that developed the first lightweight ultrasound equipment, has worked with swine producers around the globe in fine-tuning preg check, back fat, muscle mass, and those things. He also worked closely with INRA and the French Pork Institute to approve ultrasonography applications. So with that, we should be ready to roll here.
All right, let me see if I can share my screen. And
I'm just gonna let everyone know there's a chat button, but there's also a Q&A button.
Okay.
If you wanna put your questions throughout the talk in the Q&A, we're gonna get to them when we're done.
All right, so we're ready to roll, Marcio. So, I appreciate Marcio and IMV for giving me the opportunity to visit with everyone. As most of you probably out there, I've learned a lot about Zoom. And when I was growing up, let me show you how old I was. Aretha Franklin was a real famous soul singer, and she had a song named Who's Zooming Whom? And I think that's what I feel like today with all the Zoom meetings that we have going on and stuff. What I wanted to do today was just kind of outline what I think I consider 5 non-negotiables in terms of reproductive management. And so I've listed them here. What I want to do for some of them is try to present you with some data that would suggest that maybe there's some things we haven't thought about before. And then some of the other things I'm going to do is basically maybe try to get you to think about things in a little bit different way. Sometimes I think for some of these things, we may have approached it the wrong way. And then what I like to do is kind of sum up with maybe a suggestion that we all, myself included, could do a better job of taking the records and the information that we collect from our sow farms and kind of looking at them in a reproductive context to help us solve problems. So the 5 things I've listed are a little bit about neonatal management of replacement animals, and then just a little bit about recycled nutritional management. I'm not a nutritionist, and so the nutritionist can correct me if I'm wrong, if I say anything. And I'll just say I'm not a nutritionist. I want to talk a little bit about some of the things that we do here in North Carolina in the Southeast, or try to get producers to do, because we've entered our hot season, our heat stress season. And then I want to end up talking about the quality control aspects of reproductive management. And there are 2 aspects there. So there are my 5 things, Marcio. So when I think of reproductive management, and like most of us do, when I first started my career here in North Carolina, we really thought about how we handled adult animals, boars, after they were basically boars after they were in production, and then sows as they rotated through the reproductive cycle. And there wasn't really a lot of thought given to how we developed those animals. And so over the last 10 to 15 years, there's been a lot more interest. And we've collected a lot of data on farms for both boars and gilts. And I'm going to convince you that and try to show you some data that about 50% of the variation in lifetime productivity for both boars and sows really is associated with things that probably happen before they're weaned, when they're still nursing their mother on the multiplier. Okay, and so I'm going to set that up with a little bit of physiology and then show you some data with regards to that. So what I've done here is I've just blown up that developmental period. Show you a little bit of key things about when reproductive organs are formed. And here is on the bottom here, you can see that there's really kind of a real important part. And I kind of look at this as that we're building the reproductive engine, or if you will, vehicle for gilts and boars. And so if you ever build an engine, you know, you put the components of the engine together, and then you have to make the engine work with its parts to make it run functionally and stuff. And so what I tell people is most of the engine, at least for terms of the ovaries and the organs and gilts, actually occurs by the time it's born. That period is a little bit longer in boars. And then there's a period where the response elements of these organs develop and they learn how to talk to one another. And then in theory, when all that happens, the animal's capable of reaching puberty, and that's usually when we can collect them for the first time, or if we deliver them to commercial farms and give them boar exposure and they show estrus, okay? And so all of that really happens here. One of the big problems we have, or challenges we have with pigs, is that we're litter-bearing species, and as litter size increases in utero, and remember, this is a period where those dynamics or those pieces of the reproductive tracts are being developed, is space is restricted, or as litter size gets better, then there's only so much space to give to each fetus or each developing animal, and we tend to get this sort of inverse relationship. So if we increase total born, birth weight usually goes down. That's not new to anyone. And when birth weight goes down, we also get sort of restricted or limited organ development. And so what I have here is a picture from one of George Foxcroft's publications where they actually looked at birth weight and they measured the size of different organs, and you can see as the birth weight increases, these things increase as well. And the same is actually true for reproductive organs. We haven't measured them directly because it's kind of hard to take a reproductive organ out and measure it when they're young and still have the animal reproduce as an adult. But we have actually gone in and looked at some things that would suggest this also happens, and it also happens in a pretty severe or more restricted way than you see with other organs. And so I'm going to try to show you some information like that. So this is just if we have any geneticists, they can correct me too, but this is my simplistic view of how things flow to the commercial swine industry. And so what we have done with this next series of studies I'm going to show you is we've gone into the multiplier, or some people call it the grandparent farms for commercial operations. And then we've just, in some situations, we've just measured things on replacement sows and boars when they're young. And then other studies, we've gone in and actually manipulated some things. And then we've just tracked these animals through the commercial system. So they're treated when they're nursing their mother. And then when the gilts are sent to commercial farms, we track them through and see how long they stay in production. We do the same thing for boars and boar studs to see, and we can measure how much sperm they produce over their lifetime. So that's kind of the format I'm going to show you for the next couple of slides, the experimental design. So one thing we do on these multiplier units that for some reason people don't want to do, but I think it's real important, was we weighed a lot of pigs. We weighed a lot of pigs at birth, and we weighed a lot of pigs at weaning on the multiplication farms. And when you go into these farms and you talk to people about weighing pigs, it's like you're asking them to stick hot nails up under their thumbnails, you know, and they just don't want to do it. But hopefully I'm going to convince you here pretty quickly that it could be a really important thing to do. So the next two slides I'm going to show you is explain a little bit about it. So the way we look at it is we actually look at down here the variation that we see in what I'll call lifetime productivity of the sows, which is total pigs born over 6 parities. And then I'm going to show you a little bit about the boars as well, but I'm going to focus more on the sows. And this would be viable sperm produced over an animal's lifetime. So in these data sets, and the data sets I'm going to show you probably are based on about 4,000, 5,000 sows and maybe about 600 boars, okay, so that I combined. And in that data set, an animal could either have, for a sow, she could actually have 0 pigs born over her lifetime, and that means she was probably culled out after she was delivered to the commercial farm. Or we've had some sows that have 95 to 98 total pigs born over 6 parities. So if you do the math, that's 15 to 16 average over 6 parities and things like that. Boars, it's really kind of interesting. We can either have boars produce no viable sperm. That means they're culled out before their semen's ever sent to commercial farms. And then some boars we've actually produced over their lifetime produced over 40,000 insemination doses. So that's the range you get in lifetime productivity. And then what we've done is just look at characteristics of their neonatal litter and what proportion of that variation they explain. So for example, in this case, total pigs born, if you just look at that, that explains about 15% of that total variation we see in that group of sows. That is the variation from no pigs born over 6 parities to over 90 pigs. So that's kind of how this data would work. So then if we add that for all the other things we looked at, you can see that for gilts, for sows, if we look at litter characteristics that are related to number of pigs nursing, the total number of pigs born and birth weight would give us an idea, or litter birth weight would give us an idea of their neonatal environment. And then the weaning age, the pigs nursing, and the litter weaning weight would actually give us an idea of their lactational environment. And we can measure these things, but you can see that all these things together, there's about 48% of the variation in females and over 50% of the variation in males can be explained by variation we have in these traits here. And what's kind of interesting, if you remember back to that first slide I showed you, it does make some sense that if you notice that that period of mitotic activity of the gonads was much larger or longer in boars, it extended over through the neonatal period into what I'd call the nursery phase. And as you can see that things like pigs nursing and the litter weaning weight for boars explains more of that variation than it does for gilts, because most of their mitotic activity of the gonads occurred very shortly after birth. So these data seem to fit what we know about understanding about hose reproductive tracts development. So then the question becomes, this is great, what do we do about it? I'm going to show you that these are just retrospective analysis. So from this data set, these were the gilts that were born from normal size litters. So we kicked out the really small litters. We kicked out the really big litters. And we just wanted to focus on what we call a normal size litter. And then we just tracked these gilts as they went through based on their birth weight, as they went through commercial farms and their success of farrow and 6 litters. And what you can see is there's a very clear relationship between birth weight and the proportion of sows that farrowed their 6th litter. And you see that it really starts to separate in these two sort of what I call upper birth weight groups right around the first rebreeding. And I don't think that's news to anybody. That tends to be a big sort of hurdle for females to go through. But what's really interesting to me is you see these low birth weight pigs here. Now this a low birth weight pig could very well be a pig that grew well during lactation and then had a heavy weaning weight. But you see these low birth weight pigs really fall out after they're bred before they ever farrow their first litter. Okay, and so they really don't really have much reproductive potential at all. It's kind of interesting to tell people that if you take a low birth weight pig and you develop it to a point where you deliver it to a commercial farm, that's kind of like going and buying a new car and then wrecking it when you're 2 miles off the car lot. You paid for it, you have that investment, but you don't get any return from it. And that's pretty much the case with these low birth weight animals. So we can look at weaning weight. We really can't do much about birth weight, but I think there are some things we can do about weaning weight. On this graph, it's the same sort of thing, except we have through 3 parities instead of 6. These first 2 studies up here with the red lines and then the black lines with the dotted lines as well, these were ones where we actually went in and we manipulated the neonatal litter size. We had some sows nurse small litters of replacement gilts, and then other sows nurse what we have normal replacement litter gilts. And so what I've done here is actually put the number of pigs nursing and their weaning weight. These lower two lines were actually done on a commercial operation where we let the farm decide who nursed who on the multiplier. So we didn't do anything but weigh animals and then track their progression through the commercial sector of those operations. And so you can see here that it's a really kind of interesting relationship. If you just go down and look at number of pigs nursing, you go from 6.8 to 15.8, and then you have the opposite effect on weaning weight. You go from about 9.8 kilograms down to 6. And you can see that as weaning weight increases, so does the proportion of sows that make it through that third parity and things like that. And so I'm not advocating that we need to do sort of something as extreme as creating litters and multipliers that only nurse 6 or 7 pigs. That was really just done to demonstrate a concept or a point. But what I think it clearly shows is that there is a relationship between both birth weight and weaning weight and sow longevity and their productivity over their lifetime. And so what I tell people is that I do think we need to pay a little bit better attention to maybe some selection criteria that are done at those grandparent farms for those litters that go, those animals that go to commercial farms. And I would advocate, or I'd even suggest that there are some probably birth weights and some weaning weights where if gilts don't hit a certain weaning weight or they're in a certain birth weight range, they probably should be targeted for a market flow rather than a production flow, because their reproductive potential is pretty significantly limited and stuff. It's what those are, I don't know. They're probably operation specific based on genetics and things like that. What I do think, and every time I bring this up with the nutritionists, they want to shoot me, I think, but I think there's some real strategies and real things that need to be considered for some of these multiplication farms where we have the really high producing sows and may have 15 or 16 born alive and they have 8 gilts from that. We may need to look again at some strategies for supplemental feeding to supplement the sows' milk production during this period for those replacement animals. I think that could really prove very significant in terms of improving our longevity. I'm going to come back to this in a little bit, so I want you to remember that this concept about the gilts and this development at the very end, because I'm going to show you some pictures of ovaries as well. So the other thing that we struggle a lot with in the swine industry, and I'm moving on to my second point, is that when we feed sows during the reproductive cycle, it's really kind of what I call the best of worlds and the worst of worlds, or it's a roller coaster. And I think everybody knows that during lactation, it's pretty big metabolic drain on the animals, so they tend to lose weight. And then basically after we wean, we try to replace those weight and their body conditions during gestation. And we go through this cycle, and there's a lot of different strategies for doing it. There's a lot of different arguments about what they should and what they shouldn't do. What I'm going to share with you is some work that one of my colleagues here at NC State's done. I was actually on his PhD committee, and he went and worked. His name is Dr. Mark Knauer. He went and worked in the industry for a while, and he came back. And I'm happy to say that he's a much better faculty member than he was a PhD student, but that's what industry does, right? It kind of teaches us to do things. But what he's pretty much looked at is that if you can estimate body condition sort of accurately at a key point during this reproductive cycle, then you can really assess how well your whole feeding program is. And so this is how I interpret his data. So when I grew up, we used to do everything visually, right? And this is what I still teach my kids. We look at sows during gestation. We give them a body condition score of 1 to 5. If we look at them behind and you see this angled part, it's a 2. If it's nice and round, then you have to palpate. If you palpate right away and you feel backbone, then it's a 3. And if you can push down maybe the depth of your fingernail a little bit deeper, it's a 4. And so then we adjust our feeding strategies for sows based on that. So Mark Knauer, he's a faculty member that I talked about. He developed this, what we call the sow body condition caliper. That's what he called it. And I've told Mark that he's not marking it very well. When I talk to people, I call it the canaliper or the canaurometer. I don't know which one he likes better, probably neither one. But actually, right after he came to North Carolina, he had this idea, or he had this prototype. And so we call this the alpha version of the sow body caliper. I still have it. We're going to frame it when he becomes rich and famous and put it in the office of our swine educational unit. But basically what it does is it tries to more objectively measure this sort of conformation of sows. And so this is, I think there's newer versions now with a handle and some different things. But what Mark actually did on this original version, he had this idea that you would have this thing in the middle that would be ideal, and on one side you'd be too fat and one side you'd be too skinny. And so what you tend to see in these situations right here is that this is the concept, and it is based on that visual estimation I showed you part, is that as this sort of conformation changes and body condition is laid on, then you would get a wider angle of your caliper and things like that. And so what Mark has really done, which is really quite good, this is the master's work of Miranda Bryan. And what she did is she went on to commercial farms in North Carolina, and I think these data represent close to like 3,000 sows, all different parities. And their idea was they took this caliper score at different times, right after breeding, at different times during gestation. And then they went in and looked at each of these times and kind of looked at the relationship between the caliper score reading and then the productivity of the sows. And I know Mark has some data from other countries and other people that have used it with a lot more observations, but they see sort of the same thing, that for every farm, every management system, there seems to be this window where if you can get the sows in this caliper score range, regardless of how you feed them during lactation, you know, how you feed them through the rest of gestation, if you can get them in this caliper score range, then everything seems to be pretty good in terms of their number born alive, the number of pigs weaned, and the piglet survivability and stuff. And so for me, what I look at that is that I think the caliper score does do a more objective job of giving you data to analyze. That was part of Miranda's thesis. She actually had workers on the farm estimate things visually, and then somebody else used the caliper score. And the variation in the caliper score readings was very small. And as you can imagine, the variation in the human judgment of body condition scores was very large. So I think it is an objective way. And what I would say is that, you know, when you take that score and what your ideal range is could vary. But I think for me, what it says is you can take one estimate and it kind of gives you an overall summary of your nutritional program for the sows during this life cycle. And if you can figure out what that sweet spot, so to speak, is for you and your operation, then things can be good. And to be quite honest, I'll give Mark credit. When he first came, he told me that he thought we had a lot of fat sows in North Carolina in our gestation barns. And I told him I've never seen a fat sow in gestation. But and he's probably right based on these caliper scores. There's some sows that we may look visually and we don't think they're fat. But if you look at that caliper score reading and you look at their subsequent performance, it's clear they may be carrying a little bit more body condition that impedes some of the future reproductive success. So I think, so really, I think this is kind of to me, it's one of the game changers that's happened in the last 10 to 15 years. And I'm not just saying that because Mark's a faculty member, but I do think it's an objective way, and the data seems to be coming in from lots of different ways to seem that it can help you kind of adjust those feeding strategies for sows. So I put this in here because I tell people that have never been to North Carolina that come to visit, we have two seasons. We have summer and then we have summer. And this is very true for the swine industry. I think it's kind of interesting. I have this chart that I downloaded from NOAA, which is the the government organization that kind of tracks climatic change and things like that. And this is their heat index or apparent temperature chart they give to humans. And the only thing I wanted to show people is in North Carolina, we've entered a season here that we're in June and almost July, where our low temperatures at night may get down to 80. A lot of times we have daytimes high in the mid 90s, and we usually have humidities more than 70%. So even within our very well ventilated barns and things like that, we have conditions where the temperature could be close to 80 and we have high humidities. And so whenever you get out to those situations where you have very high humidities, the apparent temperature that the pigs and the people feel is a lot more. And so our summer months from about the middle of May to the end of May, really through the end of September, we're in this range right here, where throughout the whole time, the animals could be perceived and be in some type of stress situation. And as we know, it affects boars, it affects gilts. One of my favorite quotes is from Dr. Steve Pullman. He's retired now, but he's held a lot of positions in the swine industry. He's been really active with the National Pork Board. And those of you that know Steve, this won't come as a surprise to you, but Steve always will tell you, has an opinion, and he's not afraid to tell you his opinion. And he's also not afraid to tell you that you're wrong when you disagree with his opinion. So, but I kind of consider Steve as one of my early mentors when I first came here to North Carolina, so I can pick on Steve. And he said this at a National Pork Board task meeting that I attended a couple of years ago when they were shaping their research directives over the next couple of years. And Steve made the comment that production losses associated with heat stress, at least in the U.S. swine industry, probably cost the industry more than those associated with PRRS. And the first thing people did was say, that's probably not right. But then when you really go and put the numbers to it, he is probably right. And he's right by a long shot. I think we're not perfect, but we can manage. We know a lot about managing PRRS, and I'm not sure we're as far along as we think we are in terms of managing heat stress. And so I kind of wanted to actually show you, at least from a boar perspective, why Steve is probably right, with a little bit of a diagram. So this is my diagram of how sperm is produced in boars, and it has relevance to what we'll talk about, and then we'll come back and talk about sows. But about every 2 to 3 days, we have a group of sperm cells that leave the resting pool. It takes them about 5 weeks to develop, and then they're in the stored pool, which is really the cauda epididymi. And then this is where we collect them from and to use for semen processing and things like that. And so you can think of the testicle and sperm production as a factory. And what happens is that when you have 1 week of stress, so 1 week of heat stress or any type of stress on a boar, you actually have 5 weeks of decreased production. And so this is kind of, see here, I've tried to show it here with this graph here. You have a stress here. Say you have a week of heat stress. And then what you tend to see is about 5 weeks, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, if the stress goes away before the sperm production returns to normal. And that's because, if I'll back up a minute, that's because the stress probably doesn't affect these mature sperm as much as it does the developing sperm, and there's 5 weeks worth of this. So you kind of affect all of these sperm, and they have to move through the system, and you have to have sperm enter from the resting pool that aren't stressed before you get to normal. So Steve's exactly right. If from the boar perspective, 1 week of heat stress, you have 5 weeks of decreased production. And so I tell our people here, you can consider July and August and part of June really is this heat stress period. So if the boars are compromised, that's 10 weeks, right? 10 weeks of heat stress. So you might be paying for it for some boars for 50 weeks, okay? And so that's, last time I looked, 50 weeks was almost a whole year. Now, it's not exactly one-to-one like that, but that's very much the case, I think, when we deal with heat stress situations. And I think what was interesting out of that meeting is everybody was looking, and we've all focused on ways to keep animals cool and try to alleviate heat stress, which is certainly important. And I'm not going to belittle that, but what I tell people is in North Carolina, that's really difficult to do. We have really well-managed farms with good ventilation systems, and we're just in a situation where we have these long periods of hot, humid weather, and it's very difficult to keep animals cool under these heat stress conditions. So we took on some studies and we said, so let's look at other things that are being done and see if we can work on other areas and maybe accept the fact that we're going to do the best we can with heat stress and managing our animals during the summer, but we know it's going to be a stress. So that's a little bit different scenario. And so what we've done with a couple of studs, we've gone in and we did kind of what we call the boar stud audit, where we tried to look at things they were doing and consider them to be an acute stress, which may have been sort of a week or so or something like that. So an acute stress could be a vaccination that the boar responded to. And then maybe look to see what if they had any chronic stresses. Chronic stresses would be things like long periods of exposure to high temperatures like I showed. Nutrition can be, a chronic stress. Housing can be a chronic stress. So we can talk about those later, but we kind of did this audit. And so I tell my students in classes, I'm of the age that every time I go into my personal physician, he goes down the list of everything that I'm at risk of doing right. So he goes, well, you're this age, so you're at risk of having this, and you're at risk of that. So that's kind of what we did with the boar studs to try to help them look at things. And so what I wanted to show you so here we have a winter. So this would be in the winter months. And then here we have the summer. And we consider the summer environment to North Carolina to be this chronic stress. So everybody was considered to have a chronic stress, no matter how good their ventilation management was. So I want you to kind of keep this in mind. And so what we did is we tracked the number of ejaculates that were rejected for quality reasons. This could be they had low motility, usually under 70%. It could be that they had low volume, they had blood, or had a lot of cytoplasmic droplets or things like that. So each of these means is based on about 2,000 ejaculates. And then all we really did was look within stud because there are differences between stud. So you can see that in the winter, it's pretty low rejection rate. There are some differences there. And then in the summer, everything goes up, okay? But what I wanted to suggest to people, and this is a situation where the stud that didn't change from winter to summer may give us, or at least what I think is kind of the best opportunity to kind of minimize the impact that heat stress has. And so you can see stud A and C and D, I put the number of stresses they went from winter versus summer. And if you notice stud B, they stayed the same. They had two stresses, but they just kind of reshuffled them. And one of them was this heat stress that was associated with the summer months. And so you can see that then that their rejection level really didn't change, whereas all the others increased. And so my argument for this is that maybe we could do the best job we can with boars, and I'll show you some similar examples with sows in just a few minutes. The best job we can with boars to keep them cool, but we really need to look at other things we do during these really hot periods and maybe shift some of those or change some of those so we minimize the total stress load that the boars are under. And I think it's true. Stress is additive, and it's probably, we don't have to be totally free of a stress condition. I think our pigs and our boars can handle a certain stress level. It's when we get too many on them in a short period of time as we start to see decreases in production. And the other thing I'll tell you is that this process exacerbates itself. This is from Darwin Reich's, this is his death spiral. And we've all that work with boar studs know about it, is that in the summertime, we're rejecting ejaculates. So like in these studs where the ejaculates are rejecting start to increase, then we have to increase the collection frequency of the boars that are still good, and that decreases usable semen, and we have to reject more ejaculates, and we get into spiral and we get into really bad situations and stuff. And so I think being proactive and understanding, what other stresses are involved and trying to keep sperm production kind of level through these periods Granted, it's going to decrease a little bit, but we try to minimize its decrease. It may be something to do. Haven't done as much work in this area with sows as I have boars, but what I will tell you is if you just look at the physiology of the sow, farrowing's a really intense time for sows in terms of their physical activity because they're pushing piglets out, so their body temperature is going to be elevated. Their metabolism is high during lactation. The heat increment's probably pretty high because they're eating a lot of feed, and the feed has a lot of fat. So, so just the virtue of lactation would increase the body temperature sow above normal anyway in farrowing because they're having more of these things added onto their normal body temperature. And then if you add the heat stress component on top of that, or the climatic environment, you can get into situations that are really kind of detrimental. And so we do a lot of we get a lot of different types of products into our farm out at NC State, and we kind of collect data for people, and we let producers come in and look at them, and we let students sort of collect data. So that's one of the really neat things about working at the university. And this is a study we just collected. We never published it because there probably wasn't enough animals, but I just kind of wanted to throw this out. We had in the same room, we had some continuous feeding type of systems in lactation where, you know, the feed was always available for the sow 24/7 during lactation. Some of these were really expensive mechanical type devices, and some of them were simple as a PVC pipe that just, you fill a hopper and the sows eat it in one. And then we had our typical hand feeding. And this was during the summer, so this was through groups that farrowed in July through September. And what I have here is you can see that there was a slight increase in feed intake during lactation, probably not significant. But what we did do is we actually wanted to measure the body temperature of the sows in about 2 or 3 hours after each of the hand feeding events. So we measured it for the sows after hand feeding, about 2 to 3 hours after that, and then we also did it the same time for continuous feeding, realizing they're eating throughout the whole day and stuff. And so, and then what we did, I had the students do was say any sow that had a body temperature over 103.5 is heat stressed. Now, whether that's true or not, we can argue, but that's kind of the upper range of the body temperature we usually associate with sows. So anything above 103.5, we say, well, something's not exactly right. So you can see in early lactation when they're not eating much, body temperatures are pretty normal for the continuous fed sows and hand feeding. We didn't have any sows that were heat stressed. But by the time you get to the end of lactation, when they're increasing feed intake, you can see that the body temperature of the sow is getting pretty close. You know, the average body temperature sow is getting pretty close, and you see the proportion of sows that had a temperature reading above 103.5. Now, we don't know how long it stayed. It may have just spiked and then went back down, was just about double and stuff. So what I tell people is for heat stress, maybe we have to assume it's a stress, and we do the most we can with our ventilation systems. And then we look at other things we can do within the operation to minimize other things that might be stressing. Or maybe a better way of looking at it is if we have to do these things, let's spread them out over a day or a week or a season so they're not all piled up at once on top of the hottest periods of year. And so that's kind of what I mean by, at least in our part of the world, heat stress in the summer is a normal situation. We have really good barns. Tunnel ventilated barns do a good job. We have some barns that have some filtration and stuff like that, but it still gets hot and humid. And so things like feeding strategies for lactation sows, or when we do things, just simple management things like that. For boars, I can tell you that there's lots of things we can do to mitigate the stress that's on a boar during the summer months when we collect them that can really help with those sperm production profiles and stuff. So those are just some examples. And so that negotiable, I guess, isn't an absolute thing. It's kind of an encouragement to look at your operation, see which things might be stressful that occur during heat stress periods, and see if you can move them or change them so you spread that out over a period of time. And so then the last two things I want to talk about for non-negotiables or things that I think we could really, as an industry, and this group as consultants and veterinarians and service people, could really help our production systems with their retrospective evaluation of where things went wrong, and then planning for how to do things better in the future and stuff. And so we collect a lot of data from sows through this rebreeding cycle. We get numbers, we get if they came back, when they came back into heat, if they were pregnant, the number of pigs born alive, total born mummies and stillborns and things like that. And we have all these records, and there's lots of record programs that analyze, and they'll give you averages and stuff. But there hasn't really been one, from my perspective, at least from a reproductive standpoint, that looks at the reproductive physiology in conjunction with the data we collect. So what I'm going to try to end up with, I really think this might be the most important non-negotiable, if there is such one. And so Terry Coffey's a good friend of mine. He was a faculty member here at NC State when I first started, and now he's been with Murphy and Smithfield for years, and I understand he's getting ready to retire. But Terry's most famous quote is when he got to Murphy's, I think after he left NC State, he said, we collect a lot of data, and we got these lots and lots of data, but it doesn't do us any good unless we can use it. And so I would argue that this is my reproductive management troubleshooting this is the HD version, or this is the one I have to use when I teach class, because if you show kids the black and white ones, which I like, they don't like it. So the students, you have to put things in color and show them pictures today. But really, I think we could take this information on a diagram and apply it to our reproductive records, and then we can really help people pinpoint where the problems are, where weaknesses are in their operation and stuff. And so I just want to start a little bit. I have on this line right here, conception through parturition, and then I have some pictures of the embryos at different stages. Then I have the relative time period where these things happen. And then really there's some key events, and there's more of them, but these are the ones I've kind of boiled down to that kind of dictate what we see in our clinical signs or our records. So if we have conception failure, and that could be a breeding problem, that could be a semen problem, it could be an early gestation problem, and it occurs before this first pregnancy signal at 12 to 14 days, then we have regular returns. The sow never knows she's pregnant. The embryos die before they reach this. They die at this stage right here, and they return in 21-day cycles. If things are all right and she gets an adequate pregnancy signal, and we think that's about 4 or 5 embryos, then the next sort of thing is somewhere around day 30 or 35. So up until when calcification starts in fetal development, if there's embryonic death, then the sow totally reabsorbs the tissues. Okay, so that could be a complete litter, or it could be, and in that case, if that happens after day 12, you get irregular returns because she's already had the pregnancy signal, but she's lost her litter, and so then she cycle backs at some sort of irregular interval. Or if it's not a complete loss, you get low total born, low total number of pigs born alive. And then when we have problems later on, I think most people know that if you've ever seen a herd that's broke with PRRS, is that we have fetal deaths occur at different stages of gestation. And then after calcification starts, the sow tries to recycle that material, tries to reabsorb that dead tissue, and so we get different sized mummies. And then if it occurs very, very late or during the parturition process, we get stillborns. And so that's kind of how reproductive physiology works, okay? And so there's my one. And so I just show you how you can take examples of how you can take records and apply this and then come up with where you need to look or where you need to focus your management efforts on to get better. So here's a situation where you had low farrowing rates and regular returns, right? So the problem based on reproductive physiology has to be related to breeding, semen management, estrus detection, or something before day 12 of gestation. All right. something immediately after they're bred, because that's what the reproductive physiology tells us. Okay, so this is where you focus your efforts on. And then this is one of my favorite examples. So let's say we have good farrowing rates and our litter sizes are low. And in this situation, the litter size would be 7. So I'll put 7 pigs out here. But we have like 4 mummies and 2 stillborns. Okay. So this would tell you that if this is a consistent thing, that your problem is probably somewhere in mid to late gestation. Okay. I can have the exact same record distribution. So if I have good farrowing rates and low litter sizes, that's the same problem. Still have 7 pigs born alive, but only have 1 stillborn and no mummies. Then really where you begin to look is somewhere in here, because during this period right here, after day 12 and before day 30 or 35, the embryonic deaths are totally absorbed. So your clinical signs, or you either get a irregular return if she loses the entire litter, or you'll get a low total born. And the low total born is here is, I think most people would consider 8 total born as being low. So you see how if you apply reproductive physiology, you can really kind of retrospectively say, this is where I think the problem was or is, and then you can sort of devise strategies to cope with them. And so the other part of that graph that really isn't covered is when it's reproductively related is when animals don't show estrus. So what I just showed you assumes that the animal shows estrus, she's bred, and then she goes through a normal pregnancy and farrowing and things like that. So these data are from Ron Ketchum. He does a really good job collecting data, and this was just from his estimate of removal rates from all the sows that he works with in the Midwest and elsewhere. And so what you see is that this is when the sows are removed from production, and all of them are related to breeding. It's the gilts don't get bred, or the sows don't get rebred after weaning. And so they actually don't come into heat. And so what typically happens, or we think should happen in this cycle, is if a sow's weaned and everything goes well, about 90% should be in heat 4 to 7 days after weaning. And for gilts, regardless if they're cycling or not, when they're delivered to commercial farms and you're doing good boar exposure, you really probably should have 70–80% 3 to 4 weeks after boar exposure. If they're cycling already, you should pick them up because they're having normal 21-day cycles. If they're not cycling, then you'd start seeing them come in sort of in a synchronous type of response. Okay, so that's kind of the thing that should happen. And so this is my favorite quote. So since I guess I'll end with one of my favorite quotes, is the ovary of sows never lie. Okay. And so by this, I mean, when I was coming through my graduate training and other places, we had classes and we spent a lot of time in processing facilities looking at reproductive tracts and other organs of pigs to kind of survey what type of diseases and things were out there, what might be going on. And a lot of that's been replaced now with modern technology, which is good. But for reproductive technology, and this is going to be great to have the discussion at the end with Emmanuel, because some of what I'm going to tell you we may be able to do with ultrasound. But I tell people the best way to really know if a sow didn't come into heat or a gilt didn't come into heat after she was delivered to a farm is to look at her ovaries. So you send her to this processing facility and you do a reproductive tract evaluation and you see what happened. Okay, so I'm just going to kind of share with you some of the things. So this is what I use for our freshmen. It's real simple. So the life cycle of a follicle is the follicles grow, they ovulate. In pigs, they ovulate when they're about 10 to 12 millimeters. That tissue is left over and forms a corpora lutea. The corpora lutea stays on the ovary for a finite period of time. You know, if it's an estrus cycle, it's about 12 to 14 days. If it's pregnancy, hopefully it's 114 days, and then it regresses. And then that corpora lutea regresses and informs a corpora albicantia, and they stay on the ovary forever. So there's scar tissue that are there. So the ovary of animals, when you put them into context of where they should be in the reproductive cycle, kind of give you clues as to actually what's happening. Okay. So just want to bring you back to this to remember. If you wean a sow, she's not in the heat 4 to 7 days later, that's probably not normal. For gilts, if you deliver to a farm, she doesn't show estrus in 3 to 4 weeks. Some people say 5 weeks, fine, 6 weeks. That's not normal either. So then you take a subset of those and kind of look to see what's going on. So for gilts, this is what we typically see. This is a normal ovary. You see lots of nice CLs. There's some CAs. And so I tell people, you tell me you never found this gilt in heat. And they go, yep. And I said, well, she's at least cycled twice. You've got some CAs here and then some CLs. So this is really a problem where estrus detection, boar exposure, something's not right. These, on the other hand, are probably things that aren't. So this is a situation where the gilt cycle once, you can see the CAs, but then these follicles really haven't grown to a point after that initial ovulation where they came. Here's what I call low ovulation rate. I think a lot of times I get people saying, yeah, the gilts kind of swell and they kind of show all the symptoms of estrus, but they never stand. My suspicion is it could be these right here. You have a few follicles grow, you don't have a lot of estrogen, and so then you have that. And then you have these that never ovulate, they're just an infantile tract. Okay. So remember the birth weight data that I showed you very beginning? So we actually, in some of our studies where we tracked sows through their production cycle, the farm agreed to send all the gilts to a slaughter facility that weren't bred or didn't find an estrus by a certain time, and we did reproductive tract evaluations. 70% of the ones that they didn't find, if they did good heat, if we didn't find any of these, about 70-80% we found like this. And if we track those back to the birth weight or the neonatal environment, most of these were in the lower birth weight range or the lower weaning weight range when they were born or where they were nursed their sows. So I do think some of our gilt development problems, quote unquote, are actually traced back based on the ovarian morphology and stuff. And so I don't have any hard data, it's just kind of anecdotal, but I think I can make a pretty good case for that. For sows, same sort of thing here. Normal looks the same. This would actually be your typical late weaner. If you went in like 20 days after weaning and you saw this ovary, you can see that she has some CAs. That's probably left over from pregnancy, but these follicles just haven't grown. So that would suggest maybe lactational feed intake or things like that. This is a sow that just shuts down, just no growth at all. And then what we see some of are these cystic follicles right here. So this is a cystic ovary. Really what happens here is follicular growth is relatively normal, but there's not enough LH to ovulate when they're weaned. And these are the sows that come into heat and they go out of heat and come back into heat. This probably is not a feed event during lactation, but kind of what I call a piglet, a weaning, or some type of piglet management problem. Typically when you get cystic ovaries in sows is when the reproductive system hasn't recovered sufficiently, and then you reduce the suckling intensity so the sow thinks she's weaned. And this could be through early weaning, partial weaning. The sow loses a lot of pigs like in PED outbreaks and things like that. And then they grow, but there's not enough LH to ovulate them. And then two other things I want to show you is a lot of times you'll see these dark circles. These are luteinized follicles. So if a follicle doesn't ovulate, those cells start to produce progesterone and it's called luteinized. So cystic follicles will eventually luteinize, and so will these. So this is just kind of a manifestation of that cystic ovary that I showed you earlier. What we tend to see is a lot of farms that use PG600 a lot and aren't having good results. We tend to see a lot of this on farms. And so what I would suggest is that maybe they need to go back and look at the age or the type of animal they're given the PG600 to. So anyway, I'll sum up real quick. In this part, I think production records I didn't say we should, I said we need to analyze them in the context of reproductive physiology. And so you've got to think about what should happen. And if you know what should happen, then you can really pinpoint where in an operation you need to look. And this would be true even if you wanted to make improvements, you thought stuff was pretty good, or if you have a problem. And then I do think that routine reproductive tract examinations for subfertile or reproductively inactive animals, those that don't show estrus, is an important diagnostic tool. It's becoming more and more difficult to do, especially under our current conditions, but it's really underutilized. You know, there have been lots of situations where I've been called in to look at things, you know, after people have said, do this, do that, do that. And I said, well, why don't we just look at the ovaries? That'll tell us, you know, and it really does. It tells you whether it's a people problem, that the sows are showing normal estrus and ovulating, or if there's something else going on somewhere in the production system. So it won't pinpoint it, but it really helps you, you know, figure that out and stuff. So in summary, what I've tried to do is, in these negotiables, try to get you to think about maybe a new period where there may be some opportunities here. We've talked about the adult period for both the sows and the boars, and how the functional period, if you will, or how we manage the animals have an impact. And then lastly, really, I think it's important for us to be able to collect data, but then to sort of relate the data back to what we know is going on inside the animal, both from the developmental point, from the boar as well, and the female, and we make our decisions and help the people that we work with and stuff. Because I think that's probably one of the most sort of non-negotiable things, if there is such a word, that I can leave with you today. We don't do enough of this. And I think it's something we need to go back to. And that would be true for any discipline, I think. But reproduction kind of lends itself to that better, because our female reproductive management is all based along the female reproductive cycle and stuff. So with that, I'll end. I don't ever do all this by myself. Being here 33 years, one of the really neat things I like about my job is I get to work with people. I get to work with pigs, and most of the people I work with they want to learn about pigs, and that's especially the undergraduates and the graduate students and stuff. And so so over the years, I've had lots of really, really good ones, and a lot of them have gone on and done really good things. So that's all I have. I'm
Very
done.
cool. This was
Marcio.
great.
So anyway.
Thank you, Dr. Flowers.
No problem.
I will bring Emmanuel here on board. And we have 4 questions. Let's see. 5 questions. Let's see. Let's see if I can. Emmanuel, can you hear me? Hello, hello. In the meantime,
see him. Let me look
video on Manuel. In the meantime, first question, Dr. Flowers, for heat stress on boars that affects them for 5 weeks, does the sperm output mean the concentration or total number of cells, or is it the quality? Mark Hughes asking.
Yeah, so it's probably what you see first is, so the question was, I'll repeat the question, is that for heat stress in boars, when it affects it for 5 weeks, what do you really look for? So the first thing you really look for is probably you usually see quality changes as well. So you tend to see a decrease in motility, morphology might change. And then a lot of times what you see is you tend to see in some boars, you'll see an increase in cytoplasmic droplets. And so lots of times those droplets will be proximal rather than distal and things like that. So you can see decreases in numbers, but it's usually the decrease in numbers you tend to see as the heat stress period continues to increase. So like if you had a week of heat stress, chances are you wouldn't really see a decrease in numbers of total sperm, just the quality. But what we see in North Carolina is that if our heat stress starts in June, then by the end of July or the 1st of August, our boars are producing less total sperm. And so what that suggests to me is that it's even gone back further, you know, and it's affecting the way sperm move through the whole epididymis and matured, and maybe even the rate at which sperm leave that resting pool and stuff like that. And so, and then the thing about it is, and I tell people is so even after the heat stress is gone, you still have 5 weeks where it's going to be bad, because the new sperm have to enter the developing pool and not be exposed to heat stress, and they'll kind of be mixed in with the other one as well. So it's very much like a factory as well. So a lot of the low semen quality and sperm output we see here in September and October is related to the fact that the boars were stressed in July and August and stuff like that, even though the actual temperature in the barn seems normal and stuff. So
Very good. We have Emmanuel. Hi, Emmanuel.
Yes, good. Hello, Marcio, Professor Billy Flowers. Very nice to see you, to hear your presentation. Wonderful. I will have some question that will be related to ultrasonography.
Okay.
You spoke about ovaries. I do agree with you. I will repeat one of your sentence. You say the last one, ultrasound is also, I think, an important tool that is underutilized.
Yeah. I was going to let you say that, Emmanuel, because you're the expert, right? So, but ultrasonography it's a, you know, if you look at what I tell people is, if you look at what the cattle and the horse people do with ultrasonography, they can track individual follicles at any time to the point where they ovulate. Now, we have a little bit more of a challenge in pigs for doing that, but my idea would be is that we should be able to do that routinely with pig ovaries as well, and you know that could be very useful as well. And so, for example, you know, we said where you could, I'll use an analogy where we said that in Dr. Knauer's work, where he went and looked at the Caliper, you know, score at late gestation for sows. I would argue that you could go into a sow herd, and if you could scan the ovaries 4 days or 5 days, it may 4 days after the sows were weaned, you should be able to pick up large preovulatory follicles. And if you didn't find it on an ovary, you knew there was something that's going to be wrong with that sow. She either already ovulated or her follicular growth is delayed. So think about what that would allow you to do in terms of management, especially during heat stress, when you can, before you even start heat stressing or start ordering doses or things like that, saying, these cells probably aren't going to be in heat and these are and stuff. So, I do think there's a lot of potential. I agree with you there. So,
yeah. I think we have the product. We need, I mean, then to train the people to do that. It's not just, I mean, doing pregnancy control at 24, 25 days. It's a bit more challenging. We need also to have portable machines, because I think that the farmers, they don't want to come back to the 30 years ago when they are these bulky, non-portable machines. But then there are big potential in ovaries.
Yeah. So the analogy I use when people want to learn how to look at the ovary versus the scan for pregnancy, I say the difference is like when you learn how to do pregnancy detection, it's like taking a quiz in an undergraduate class. And when you want to scan the ovary to look at follicles, it's like taking your boards for veterinary school, right? So that's the difference. I mean, it really is the difference. It's a lot more intense, and you need a lot more training, and you need a lot more interpretation and stuff. But I think we can get there. I mean, it's just, you know, something that just needs to be worked on and stuff.
Yeah.
So.
Very good, my friend.
May I ask another question or another remark regarding body condition? Because this, I think, it's already used, and it's, let's say, far easier than ovary scanning.
Yeah.
Frankly speaking, Dr. Flowers, I never heard about Caliper regarding body condition. So, but we are trying to promote also the body condition scoring analysis or checking with ultrasound. And you probably know that there are today some quite portable, good ultrasound that can also be used with the same probe for the back fat control, which is, I think, something very important. And my question is, when during the cycle or even after weaning, will you recommend to do this back fat control or let's say body condition analysis?
So there's probably people with, I know there's people listening that have a lot more experience with that than I do, but with the study that I was involved with Dr. Knauer and Miranda, they did them at different times. And their objective was, let me find the time that has the best correlation with these things that happen. So it's kind of like a farm has this feeding program for sows, and you can measure, like you can measure it at weaning, you can measure it at whatever. But let's pick one time where they're just going to measure it once, and that gives them a point of how well they're doing. So the idea would be is that if they measured them late in gestation, like Mark did, and I think that's what his data showed, if you have 90% of your sows in your sweet spot, whatever that is, and you've done a pretty good job. I do think if I was doing it, I think, you know, how you get them to that ideal body condition score, however you want to measure it, kind of depends on where they start from, right? And so you kind of have to have some idea of what they are when they're weaned or they're bred. And so I think for me, you kind of need to, it almost seems like you could do it 2 times, right? You scan them at the very beginning of that process and you know where they are, and then you're going to scan them sort of, you know, if you need to make interventions somewhere in your feeding level, then you need to scan them before they get to late gestation, because you want to have the time to alter the feed and stuff like that. So so I don't know. I do know it's kind of interesting. I have to be honest, I was a little bit skeptical of Mark's data when he started presenting and started doing it until I actually went with him to farms and saw him doing it and stuff. And people can use that caliber a lot faster than they can do the process that I was taught. Like look at the sow from behind and then palpate. So you just put it down, boom, and then you're done, you know. And so and so he made a believer out of me, and I was skeptical, you know. I you know, Mark and I got into arguments. Does the body type of the sow affect the reading? It probably does, but if your genetics are such you have a wider, sort of shorter sow, then your sweet spot is probably going to be different than you have a longer, narrower sow. So you just adjust it for your operation, and he's probably right. To your question about ultrasound, in some of Miranda's studies, she did have our ultrasound technician scan the gilts and the sows and look at bat fat and loin eye. It was mostly with the gilts. I don't think she scanned many of sows. And obviously the ultrasound is the most accurate because you're actually looking at the tissues. But there was a really high correlation with what they got from the ultrasound and estimate of back fat depth at the 10th rib, and then that caliper score as well. So that was good, you know, and stuff. So
yeah. I challenge you, Dr. Flowers. I will go to North Carolina and show you that with ultrasound, you can do this very fast also and very accurately.
Okay. So you're a lot more nimble than I am. So I'm getting old and slow, right? So it's,
yeah. Look at my hairs. They're also white.
So.
If Emmanuel didn't have a challenge, he wouldn't be a French, right? I work with several
French.
That's
right. That's right.
I love the intensity. Very good, Emmanuel. I know Dr. Flowers, just to make sure you don't have any meeting that you are missing.
No, I'm good. I'm good. Yeah.
So. All right. So we have a bunch of questions, my friends. Here we have over 10 or 15 questions as well.
It's no problem.
Let's get to those here now. Let's see. I don't even know where to start. So Gustavo de Quadro Hansen, is there any trial that has compared the caliper with ultrasound back fat measurements? Is his question.
So that question, I think the question was, has there been any trials that have compared the caliper with the ultrasound? So Mark and Miranda actually did that. They didn't do it. I have to go back. As soon as the talk's over, I'll go look at Miranda's thesis is in my shelf right here. But I do think that the ultrasound was a lot more accurate. But the correlation between the caliper and the ultrasound was really good. And then as you'd expect, I don't think they looked at technician differences with ultrasound. We had one person do the ultrasound where they had several people do the caliper and stuff. So, so I think the thing with ultrasound, and this is in general, I think Emmanuel's right. Ultrasound does require a lot more training than the caliper. But once you're trained, and if you have an SOP for training people, then there's really not that much variation. All the studies that I've looked at on the cattle side that have looked at variation, and they'll take one steer and have 5 different people scan the steer for back fat and ultrasound and cattle and stuff. It's all very, very close and stuff like that, because you're actually looking at the tissue layers and stuff like that. But I don't know that there's been any direct study that have compared one versus the other. So then the way you would do those studies, and you can't really do this on a reproductive thing, is you'd have people do a caliper reading, you'd have people do the ultrasound, and then you want to kill the animal and actually measure what's there, right? You'd measure the back fat and loin. We can't really do that but I would say the ultrasound my bias would be it's more accurate than the caliper, and the caliper is much more accurate than the visual estimations and stuff. So
yeah, and it's as anything in life, there's pros and cons, right? And
yeah.
Dr. Ryushi mentioned here, we have used ultrasound and weight tapes in the past.
Yeah.
Sometimes they take too much time in some large commercial farms. In that the caliper is it's faster and easier. So my take is, I've been to farms. I've seen farms, for example, in Canada, do a great job with ultrasound. If I go to a farm, they have 30 PSY, they're doing a great job, their ultrasound. I'm not gonna change them.
Sure.
But the caliper takes about 5 seconds per sow, and the back fat takes about, from NOWR's data, it's about 12 or 15 seconds, something like that. Again, everything has pros and cons. I don't think we need to get much more into that aspect right now, since we have lots of more questions here, my friends. Let's see if we can cross them over here. Manuel is asking, for the first gilt insemination, what's more important, age or weight?
I would say, so the question is about the first insemination, age or weight. And so my bias is it's probably age. And then, but you have to, so the way I always tell people is that usually age and weight are highly correlated in pigs, the way we manage them up to a certain point. And so I've always looked at puberty as a function of mostly age. Okay. But the success of the sow after maybe in her first lactation, there is some sort of evidence that, at least in some of our systems here, the ones that tend to be a little bit heavier, they're weigh a little bit more at their first mating, tend to survive that first lactation a little bit better. But it's a hard thing to tease out, because age and weight are usually highly correlated in gilts. So the older gilts usually weigh more and stuff like that. So I think Dr. Bartolza and his group in Brazil have done a lot of really neat work. And then George Foxcroft and them have done probably some work too, but it's really the work from Brazil. They've done a lot of work where they've actually sort of fed gilts at different levels, from about the nursery phase through the developmental phase, and then they've bred them at different age and weight combinations and stuff. And I think what they would say is there's this minimum level, and it may vary a little bit with genetic lines. That's really the key. So if you have an animal that's a certain age, but she's below this minimum level of weight, then she's probably not going to be that good. But if the animals are the right age and they're all of this, this kind of above the minimum weight, then it usually works out all right and stuff like that. The only thing I don't know how this would change is I don't know how it would change in our systems now, where we're going to larger groups in pen gestation. and things like that. And in some of our dynamic, you know, we have some farms that have a dynamic gestation system where they have sows at all stages of pregnancy, and they go into the automatic feeding system and stuff. And so I would know, if you just spend any time and just sit in barns and look in those, the gilts that kind of enter those systems at a lighter weight, they're not going to gain weight, right? So the gilts that come in, it's for gilts, and in sows it may or may not be that case, but sows that enter those systems at lighter weights usually don't gain. I mean, I'm talking about the thin ones usually stay thin throughout the whole period. So that would argue that maybe in those type of systems, maybe trying to get more weight on them as a gilt and maintaining that weight throughout their life cycle might actually be more important and stuff. So, but to make a long story short, my bias would be age would be the most important thing. Although I think you can breed animals too young. I think what we've done in the industry over the years, and my genetic friends get mad at me, but we've selected phenotypically for animals that have less back fat at heavier weights and older ages. So what we've done is we've kind of selected for animals that mature slower physiologically, and so I think what we've done to some extent is we've kind of spread out or uncoupled what I consider our like physiological maturity, puberty, from our reproductive maturity. So when I came to North Carolina back in the late 80s, there was a genetic company, and they're no longer in existence, but their sows were, their genetic line would put on weight really fast and put in a lot of back fat early. And those animals, you could breed them at the first estrus at a young age and they would be fine. And they would always come into heat. And now what I see is, now I see a lot of animals, they show signs of estrus at a pretty young age, but I'm not sure I'd breed them at that age. If you go back to those pictures of the ovaries that I showed you, the gilts, so a lot of those animals that you saw, and some of those, that low ovulation rate, those were animals that were bred at a pretty young age, you know, but they'd reached puberty. So maybe they sought their first cycle at 170 days of age, and they bred them at their second cycle 190 days of age. And I don't remember the weight. And so I do think that there's this period where an animal will reach puberty. There's an age, but I do think that she's not reproductively mature yet, which I think 30 years ago, I think when she reached puberty, she was pretty close to be reproductively mature from other things. And I think that's what our genetics have done in selecting for leaner and leaner animals and stuff. So that's, for what it's worth, that's just a reproductive physiology view on what's happening. And it's not a bad thing or it's not a good thing. It's just what we see and stuff. We see the same thing in boars, by the way. So I've probably done as much work with puberty in boars and things like that, and working with people that bring boars into studs. And when I first started in here, we could bring boars in and get them trained at 6 months and they were ready to go. You start them, you get them trained. And now, if for some genetic lines of the really lean boars, if you try to start training them at 6 months, you'll ruin them. You need to give them some extra time for the things to kind of collect and stuff. So it's kind of interesting. So
very good.
My had, sorry, Marcio, Dr. Flores, two things, because Dr. Flores speak about guilt. That was about the question. Ultrasound is also a tool that can be used, I mean, for guilt puberty. Very important. I know it's not on a commercial, on a routine way, but this is something reliable, accurate, that allows, I mean, you to diagnose whether the sows, the guilt, sorry, is ready to be inseminated or not. I think it's important. And regarding boars, it's the same. There are people who are, it's also in university today, in research center, people are checking, I mean, the testis and the epididymis, sorry.
yeah.
Plus also, I think Dr. Flowers will confirm this additional rectal examination to see the sexual glands and the bulboretral, prostate, and vesicles. So it's just to add and to confirm that ultrasound is really, I mean, under estimated and underutilized tool.
Very good. We have 12 questions, so let's see if we can
Okay.
crush them
I'll
here.
try to keep my answers shorter. Sorry, Marcio.
Sure. No, you're good. You're good. I know
We like it.
we love it. Yeah. So Dr. Joe Crenshaw is asking, what are the reasons for second parity dip in litter size?
So, so that's a good question. And so the second parity dip, you know, some farms have it and some farms don't, we see here. So I'll go back to that original graph that I showed you. And so really the second parity dip in litter size, the animals farrow, so they get pregnant, so they get all the signals, and they really don't have an increase in stillborns or mummies, right? So if you go back to that chart, then it really is probably either in ovulation rate, which is a possible problem. It can be influenced by feed intake and things like that, or it's that uterine environment hasn't fully recovered. So then when those embryos start to develop, you know, and they start to implant, not all of them can implant and things like that. So from a physiological standpoint, that's how you get that second parity dip. If you look at, you know, like, and it's probably related to that female is, you know, the first parity sow is probably the most difficult female to manage metabolically, you know, of all the animals that we have. She, you know, she's still growing probably. If people were to really, if the nutritionists were really to do a true like estimation of a second parity sow protein and energy and mineral requirements, their nutritional requirements like they do for all sows, probably the second parity sows would, my guess would be a little bit higher than some of the older parity sows, even though, you know, her production isn't is great. You know, she's still growing and things like that. And the other thing is what I've noticed, and this is just a personal observation, they just, you know, it's their first time. Think about it this way. I'll tell you, I have a son that's taking his driver's ed during the pandemic, which is really interesting, right? So if you want to challenge, do that, right? But it's just like kids learning to drive for the first time. It's the first time they faced everything on the road. They're not exactly what sure to do. So this is the first time the sow's reproductive system has gone through a lactation and had to recover and come back. And there's probably some things that just don't coordinate or jive well and stuff. You know, so my expectation is that if I would expect anything, it would be that it would decrease, you know, for whatever reason. So, but for a physiological standpoint, it's one of two things. It's either they have a lower ovulation rate, which I think there was actually some work that Kate Dewey and Barb Straw did years ago, where they actually went in and looked at some sows with the second parity dip. And it was these sows that came back into heat 7 to 10 days after weaning. They actually went and looked in at ovulation rate, and both ovulation rate and embryonic survival were lower in that subset of sows. I mean, it was a long time ago, but I remember that. And so that physiologically that would happen. So then you can say, why does that happen? And it probably has to do with, you know, recovery of the reproductive system, or converting from a catabolic state, which is lactation, to an anabolic state, and all those things and stuff. So
very good. Next one here is we're probably going to take a few more just here, folks, so we can get ready onto our days. What would be an ideal, Sarah is asking, what would be an ideal interval for semen collection on tropical climate countries, hot seasons, almost all over the year, so like North Carolina?
So I'm sorry, you zoomed in and out, Marcio. Ask the question again. You died in the middle of it, so it's
sorry. Ideal interval for semen collection. So
what we've tried to get people to do, and they don't like to do it, but it works. Let me see if I can. I may be able to share a screen again.
Yep.
So let me go one more. So so I didn't include this in the talk, but what we did was we did a study, and we actually did it controlled and on farms. And I don't know what the ideal one is, but we looked at what farms normally do, and then we looked at what farms typically do during the summertime when they typically have to increase. And so the way we did the study is that, so like we had 1.5 times, and the boars were collected the same time over 2 weeks. So they might have been collected like a Tuesday and a Friday or something like that, right, or whatever. And then the variable was we just we collected them an average of 1.5 times a week, you know, but we flipped the coin on the day, and once we got to that, we quit collecting them and stuff. So we did the same thing with 3 times a week, which would be maybe what you would do during the summer, because you got to get semen doses out the door. And so what it kind of shows you is that when you increase collection frequency, it's going to go down because you're collecting more. You're actually collecting more times, and so you're going to deplete each ejaculate. But what really happens is, in terms of it doesn't go down as much if you can keep it on a consistent pattern. So what boars don't like is it to be inconsistent. So that's a problem, because that's the life of all the swine farms, right? So you go into a boar stud in a day, and you have 20 ejaculates that are rejected, so you got to collect 20 more boars to make them up. And the next day you might have 40, and then it's a very inconsistent which boars you might collect more frequently, because you got to keep your semen going out the door. So what we've tried to get them to do is, in the summer months here, know when your heavy days are, and then keep boars on a consistent collection frequency. And that does mean you throw out some ejaculates, which they hate to do, right? But in the long run, it kind of pays the best. So I don't necessarily need, if you wanted to reduce your collection frequency, it was a really good question. I don't know how much you would have to reduce it to alleviate the stress. So I think that, I don't know if, like, if you're collecting them twice a week or every 4 days, if giving them every 8 days would make that much difference. Because the stress is still on the animal, and your collection frequency is you're harvesting it. So I think my idea would be, it's like a factory, right? So if the boars adjust, they actually do adjust to your collection frequency if you change them. And so when we do studies here, if we go collect them, boars have been collected once a week for like a year, and then we start collecting them twice a week, that second collection in that week is really, really low. But then if we collect them twice a week for 6 months, those two collections start to even out a little bit. So I don't know what that mechanism is, but it's a real effect and stuff. So it's kind of interesting.
Very good.
So I think the key there is that you may not have to change your collection frequency. You just need to keep it consistent for your boars. So there's some boars you collect this day and some boars you collect that day. And then when I've been in most boar studs, it's kind of like they have all these orders to fill, so they have to get semen out the door to the farms. And so they're going to collect boars until they get that. And they know which ones collect easy, which ones don't. So the easy ones get collected a lot more frequently than the ones that are difficult, especially when it's getting close to quitting time. I mean, that's the reality of what people do in boar studs and stuff. So, so it's a hard thing to do, but it's the consistency, in my mind, under heat stress is just as important as the frequency. So.
Consistency and frequency. Very good. The last question here, I think both of you might like it, is high number of NIPS, so not in pigs, right? Empty at farrowing, coming through after 2 ultrasounds, day 22 and 25, and day 46 and 55. What should Tajana is her name, be looking for?
So if you go back to, so it's conceivable that to me, if I'll go back to that diagram, so it's conceivable that what happens is that, so there's 2 things I would look at from a physiological standpoint. so remember that you only need about 4 or 5 fetuses at day 12 for the female to be programmed to go to term. So that there's actually another pregnancy signal that occurs just before implantation, but we didn't talk about it. But so you could have a situation where that sow actually, she was pregnant. You scanned her at day 30 or so, and then she had it, and she could have had embryos. You see the amniotic sacs. And then at some point after that, she actually loses the fetuses, but she actually may show up not in pig because her reproductive system has been programmed, the CL's been programmed to actually go to term. And so Emmanuel can comment better than I do, but when we go in and look for pseudo-pregnant sows, we usually do it in later gestation, and we change what we look for as our reference points. So in early gestation, you're looking at for the dark circle in the amniotic vesicles. In late gestation, we look for remnants of a fetal skeleton within the sac. So if we just see our dark circles are amniotic vesicles, but we can't find any evidence of fetal development or a skeleton, we think the animal's pseudo-pregnant, not in pig and stuff, and vice versa. But physiologically, that can happen, and it's probably either you had a low ovulation rate to start with, or you can have a normal ovulation rate, but you're having a lot of those losses kind of in that 20 to 25 to 30 day period. It's losing pretty much all the embryos, and they're reabsorbing them, but yet she still thinks she's pregnant and stuff. And my experience has been it's not something overt, you know, like a PERS or a disease or something like that, because that usually causes them to abort. It's kind of like if there is such a thing as a subtle insult to the system and stuff. So that's kind of
the question I have,
yeah,
Billy, on this one, and Emmanuel, is, okay, is it a pseudo pregnancy? Maybe sometimes, but I think more often than not is actually it's she doesn't have any pigs at all for 2 months, right?
Yeah, so it could be, yeah. So it's but there are there are, you know, we have farms here that and we have sows where, you know, I'm confident that they do a really good job of scanning with the ultrasound, and they do a really good job of running the boars at 21 days after they're bred. They scan them twice, you know, and they're really good. And there's sows that they actually belly down. They're getting some type of abdominal displacement, but then they don't have pigs. And then the few times we've actually looked at those sows and done slaughter checks, they have CLs, right? So the CL didn't regress, and the uterus is full of fluid, but there's no pigs, and there's really no vestiges of any sort of embryonic membranes either, which suggests to me that the death loss occurred earlier and it reabsorbed and stuff. So, I mean, the other thing, obviously there's some other things that can happen. So, so estrogen is the signal that the embryos produce at day 12 that maintain the CL and stimulate the uterus to do that. So if you have extraneous estrogen in the environment, like mycotoxins or things like that, I mean, and the sow gets it, she will act like she's pregnant, even though she doesn't have, you know, fetuses and stuff like that. You can program the sow to go to term. So like I can take a cycling sow, and if I give her estrogen, just give her shots of estrogen at the right time during her cycle, I can make her think she's pregnant, even though she's never been bred. So you can do that. So there are, you know, there are these things that we just don't know about and stuff like that. So, I mean, usually that's what comes up. The first thing people want to check when you have high levels of sows that are not in pig, or are there mycotoxins in the feed and stuff. And so,
always the feed, right?
Oh yeah, it's always the feed, right? So anyway, but
I love it. Any comments, Emmanuel, before we wrap up?
I didn't know. Frankly speaking, I didn't know about this. I don't know what is the rate of this this sow that looks like in pigs, and they are not actually. I will just sum up, giving the last word, I mean, to Dr. Flowers, Professor Flowers, sorry. just, I mean, day 18, 19, you will see maybe 1, 2 black vesicle sac, just the liquid of the pregnancy. Later on, 22, 23 days, the development start to be bigger. 25 days, you start to see the embryo. 30 days, you can, even a bit earlier, you can see the heartbeat. 45 days, you can see the ribs, the skeletic, up to the end. And some people are even using the ultrasound in the farrowing crate, I mean, to see whether there are still some piglets remaining, or placenta also. But yeah, generally speaking, but I didn't know about and I don't know if it is often that could have sows that looks like pregnant and they are not, actually not in pigs.
So we, for just to sum up, so we probably have, on average here in North Carolina with the farms that I've seen, you know, in the late summer and early fall, we have a higher incidence of those pigs, sows that are not impregnant. And so in 33 years, it's pretty consistent. And so I think it's something real. I'm not exactly sure what it is. It could be, you know, some vestige left over from when, you know, our domestics, or some of the wild ancestors of our pigs, or seasonal breeders or whatever. But it's and then some people have always attributed to, that's when you'd be feeding the new corn that was harvested. You know, you're getting rid of the old corn and things like that, and new corn's coming in, and so it could be related to mycotoxins. But we see it here about every year. Some years are worse than others. Some years it'll spike to like 15%, and other years it stays between 5 and 10%, you know.
Wow. And
then the rest of the year it's usually like 1 or 2 or 3% or something like that. I think somebody in the chat said they see about 3% for non-in-pig and stuff. So it's yeah.
Very good. Well, thanks everyone for joining. I know we passed the time here, so we really appreciate that. Thanks, Dr. Flowers, so much
No
for your
problem.
time, and
Take care.
your knowledge.
Everybody be
Thanks
safe. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Emmanuel.
Take care.
Appreciate it.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Flowers. Thank you, Marcio. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.